Margaret Osibonsu had been reviewing workers' compensation claims for Hargrove and Pellman Insurance Group for 11 months when the file landed on her desk at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning. The name on the intake form was Darnell Whitfield, Senior Operations Manager, Kestrel Logistics Solutions. I recognized the company letterhead before I recognized anything else, the angular black falcon, the sans serif font in corporate navy, because I had stared at that logo for 4 years of my life, through fluorescent breakroom lights and the kind of exhaustion that sits behind your eyes and never fully leaves. I set my coffee down. I opened the file. I read the date of the incident. I read the employee's documented temperature at the time of the reported workplace injury. 105 degrees Fahrenheit. I read the supervisor's note, time-stamped the same afternoon. Employee was reminded of the mandatory attendance policy and chose to remain on premises. I read the denial reason the previous adjuster had flagged, insufficient documentation of employer negligence. Claim status, pending secondary review. I closed the file. I opened it again. I am Margaret Osibonsu, Senior Medical Claims Reviewer, Tier III Specialist, Hargrove and Pellman Insurance Group. I have been doing this work for 11 months. Before that, I spent 8 years doing something else entirely. And before that, someone told me I would never be worth the paper my ambitions were printed on. That file sat on my desk. I pulled the full policy. I made a note in the system. The claim was denied. But not the way you think. Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you have ever been told you would never amount to anything by someone who should have believed in you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. Because what I am about to share took me 19 years to be able to say out loud. 19 years of silence, of building, of choosing not to speak when speaking would have felt better in the moment, but cost me everything in the long run. This is not a story about revenge. I need you to understand that before we go any further. This is a story about what happens when the truth finally has enough room to stand up straight. But to understand why that moment meant what it did, why my hands were completely steady when every part of me had a reason to shake, I have to take you back. 19 years back. I was 26 years old. I had a community college transcript, a certificate in medical billing and coding that I had earned at night while working days at a dry cleaner on Flournoy Street, and an acceptance letter from the Health Information Management program at Carver Technical Institute. Tuition, first semester, $11,400. I did not have $11,400. I had $3,212 in a savings account I had been building for 2 years, $1 at a time, sometimes literally. What I also had was a grandmother, Cecilia Osibonsu, my father's mother, the only person in my family who had ever looked at me and seen something worth looking at, who had passed away 14 months earlier and left behind a modest estate. Her house on Delmer Avenue had sold for $81,000. After expenses and the attorney's fees, there was roughly $60,000 left. She had told me, sitting in her kitchen 3 years before she died, with her hands wrapped around a mug of Milo, that she intended to split that money between her 4 grandchildren, $15,000 each. She had said my name specifically. She had said, Margaret, you are the one who is going to do something with it. She did not put it in writing. That was the crack in the foundation that the rest of my family drove a bulldozer through. My uncle Gerald Osibonsu was the executor of the estate. He is a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of someone who has never had a single important decision questioned. He called a family meeting 3 weeks after the house closed. We sat in his living room in Decatur, Georgia, my Aunt Phyllis, my cousins Darnell and Rochelle, my mother and me. Gerald stood near the fireplace as if he were presenting a quarterly report. He said, Mama didn't leave a formal will beyond the house. The distribution of the remaining assets is at the executor's discretion. I said, she told me, he said. What she told you and what is legally documented are 2 different things, Margaret. We are dealing with legal documents here. My mother said nothing. I want you to understand that. She sat on Gerald's couch with her hands folded in her lap and she said nothing. Gerald announced that the estate would be divided between himself, his sister, my mother, and his brother Frederick in equal thirds. The grandchildren received nothing. He called it generational consolidation. He used that phrase as if it were a thing that existed. I said, she wanted me to go back to school. That money was supposed to, Aunt Phyllis said from the corner of the room where she had been inspecting Gerald's bookshelf. School for what, Margaret? Medical billing. Baby, that is not a career. That is a speed bump. Gerald said, "You are 26 years old. If you wanted to go to school, you should have gone when you were 18 like everyone else." My cousin Rochelle, who was eating a clementine and had been silent until this moment, said, "She's always had these big ideas. Remember when she was going to be a nurse? She said it the way you would say remember when she was going to be an astronaut, with the particular fondness people reserve for things they have already decided are impossible." I took my $11,400 acceptance letter and I drove home. I sat in my car, in the parking lot of my apartment complex, for 45 minutes. Then I went inside, opened the drawer of my nightstand, and took out a piece of paper. I wrote down the full name of the program: Health Information Management, Bachelor of Science Completion Track, Carver Technical Institute, cohort beginning January. I folded the paper twice. I put it in my wallet behind my library card. I kept it there for 6 years. I looked at it when I needed to remember what I was building toward. I did not call Gerald. I did not call my mother. I started looking for another way in. The other way in took longer than I wanted and cost more than I had. That is the honest version of what happened, and I am committed to the honest version. I applied for a federal Pell Grant. I qualified for $4,550 per year. I applied for every scholarship listed on Carver Technical Institute's financial aid page, 11 in total. I was awarded one, the Melvina Crooks Memorial Scholarship for Non-Traditional Students, in the amount of $1,200. I had a shortfall of approximately $5,650 for the first year alone, not counting books, not counting the bus pass, not counting the 2 nights a week I would need to pay my neighbor Mrs. Adiz Fortuné $10 to watch my cat because my building's lease said no pets, and I had a cat named Ptolemy who was my only consistent source of comfort, and I was not giving him up. I applied for a private student loan. I was rejected because my debt-to-income ratio was flagged. I applied again through a different lender. I was rejected again. The third application I submitted with a letter, 3 pages, single-spaced, explaining exactly why I was a sound investment. The loan officer at Meridian Community Credit Union, a man named Harold Tedjasant, called me 2 weeks later. He said he had never received a personal letter with a loan application before. He said he had read it twice. He approved me for $6,000 at a rate that was not predatory, which was more than I had hoped for from a third attempt. I started at Carver in January. I worked at the dry cleaner Tuesday through Saturday, 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. I attended class Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday evenings. I studied on Sundays at the public library on Auburn Avenue because my apartment's overhead light had a flicker that gave me headaches, and I could not afford to have the building manager fix it fast enough to matter. My first semester, I failed Introduction to Healthcare Informatics. Not barely failed, failed with a 58, which meant I had to retake it, which meant I fell behind the cohort schedule, which meant my projected graduation date shifted by a full semester, which meant 6 additional months of loan interest and 6 additional months of the dry cleaner and 6 additional months of Ptolemy watching me eat cereal over the sink at midnight. I sat in the office of Dr. Viviana Champong, the program director, after I got my final grade. I expected her to tell me to reconsider my enrollment. Instead, she said, "You scored a 91 on the clinical coding module. You have a specific competency and a general gap. Come back in August and close the gap." I said, "I cannot afford," she said. "The summer retake fee is waived for students who failed by fewer than 15 points and submit a learning plan. Write me a learning plan." I wrote her a learning plan. It was 8 pages. She approved it in 2 days. I retook the course in August and scored an 87. My family's position on all of this was consistent and clear. My mother called me in November of my first year, not to ask how school was going, but to tell me that Gerald was hosting Thanksgiving and expected everyone to be there, and could I bring the sweet potato pie because Phyllis's knees were bad. I said I had an informatics final on the Monday after Thanksgiving, and I needed the weekend to study. She said, "Margaret, you are still doing that school thing, not cruelly. That is almost the harder version." She said it the way you say you are still doing that pottery class, with a mild, faintly baffled indulgence, as if it were a hobby I had not yet outgrown. I brought the sweet potato pie. I passed the final with a 79. I consider that a personal victory that no one in that Decatur living room will ever know about. The health insurance coverage question came up in my second year. My employer-sponsored plan through the dry cleaner covered catastrophic events, and not much else. The deductible was $4,000, and the premium was coming out of my check every 2 weeks for a plan that felt, as I reviewed it for the first time with the actual literacy to read an insurance policy, like a document designed to create the impression of coverage without the substance of it. That was the year I started understanding how these instruments actually worked, not as a consumer being protected by them, as someone beginning to see the architecture underneath. I completed my Bachelor of Science in Health Information Management in May, 3 years and 1 semester after I started. I did not walk at graduation. I was working. I sent Dr. Achampong a card, which she later told me she kept on her office bulletin board for years, and which I only know because she told me so the day she wrote me a recommendation letter for something much larger. That something much larger was the Whitmore Kessler Fellowship in Medical Claims Analysis, a 2-year postgraduate training program administered jointly by the Georgia Department of Insurance and 4 participating insurance carriers, one of which was Hargrove and Pellman. The fellowship trained 12 candidates per cohort in the clinical and regulatory frameworks governing workers' compensation, employer liability, and occupational health insurance policy. It was, at the time, one of the only programs in the southeastern United States that bridged clinical health information management with forensic insurance review at a professional level. I found out about it from a flyer on Dr. Achampong's office door. I applied the same week I received my degree. The application required 3 professional references, a timed case analysis exercise, and a written statement of purpose that could not exceed 1,000 words. I wrote 997 words. I submitted it on a Thursday. I received an interview invitation on a Friday. I want to be precise about that timeline because I want you to understand that I had spent 3.5 years building exactly the foundation that application required, and the preparation was not invisible. It showed up in the case analysis score. It showed up in the interview. And it showed up when the fellowship coordinator, a meticulous woman named Patricia Lowe Harrington, who later became one of the 2 people in my professional life I would trust with anything, called me to offer admission. The Whitmore Kessler Fellowship paid a stipend of $31,000 per year. It also covered the cost of the Registered Health Information Administrator certification exam, which I sat for in my second fellowship year and passed on the first attempt with a score of 94. I left the dry cleaner the day the fellowship began. I did not give notice early. I gave notice exactly 2 weeks out, as the employee manual specified, and I worked every one of those 14 days without mentioning to a single coworker what I was about to do. I was working my second fellowship rotation at Hargrove and Pellman's Atlanta regional office when I reviewed my first contested workers' compensation claim. The case involved a warehouse worker at a food distribution company who had sustained a repetitive stress injury over 18 months and whose employer had repeatedly classified his medical appointments as personal leave rather than occupationally related care. The original denial had been upheld twice in internal review. I flagged 4 documentation errors, 2 policy misclassifications, and 1 instance where the employer's submitted medical records had been altered, not dramatically, not criminally obviously, but altered in a way that I could see because I had spent 3 years learning exactly how these documents were supposed to look. Patricia Lowe Harrington reviewed my analysis. She sat across the desk from me and said, "How long have you been doing this?" I said, "This is my 9th month." She said, "This is 3rd-year work." Then she submitted my analysis to the senior review panel without changing a word. The claim was overturned. The worker received back compensation covering 14 months of medical expenses. I did not celebrate. I went home, sat with Ptolemy, and thought about the warehouse worker's 14 months, what those months had felt like from the inside, the specialist appointments he had probably delayed, the bills he had probably managed with the particular creativity of someone who cannot afford to stop. There was a moment, roughly 8 months into the fellowship, when my cousin Rochelle called me. Not to ask about my life, Rochelle did not ask about my life. She called because she was having a dispute with her landlord and thought I might know something about tenant law because, as she explained, "You're doing something with insurance or whatever, right?" I said I was, yes. She did not ask what. I did not volunteer it. When we hung up, I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand. I could have told her. I had thought about it, the clean, simple satisfaction of saying the full title out loud to someone who had once described my ambitions as these big ideas while eating a clementine. But I had learned something in those months at Hargrove and Pellman. The value of information is inseparable from its timing. You do not present a finding before the record is complete. You wait until every document is in the file. Then you present it once, clearly, and let it stand on its own. I put the phone down. I went back to work. I completed the Whitmore Kessler Fellowship in August of that year. Hargrove and Pellman offered me a position as a medical claims analyst, grade II, at their Atlanta regional office at a starting salary of $58,000 annually. I accepted. Over the following 6 years, I advanced through grade III, then to senior analyst. Then, following an 18-month period in which I developed and implemented a documentation review protocol that reduced contested claim processing time by an average of 31% across 3 regional offices, to my current title, Senior Medical Claims Reviewer, Tier III Specialist. My department handles all secondary and tertiary review of disputed workers' compensation and occupational health claims in the southeastern region. Every claim that has been denied once and appealed, or that presents documentation anomalies significant enough to require specialist examination, comes through my office. I have a team of 4 analysts reporting to me. I have a corner desk that I chose specifically because it faces the window rather than the door, because I have spent enough of my life facing doors, waiting for something to come through them. My direct supervisor is Hargrove and Pellman's Regional Director of Claims, a man named Desmond Fairweather Hall, who introduced me to a compliance attorney named Sylvia Morrow-Baptiste of the firm Morrow-Baptiste and Associates 3 years ago when we needed outside counsel on a complex employer misrepresentation case. Sylvia and I have worked together on 4 cases since. She is someone I trust professionally and for whose judgment I have significant respect, which I do not say about many people. My salary is now $89,400 per year. I have retirement savings that I began contributing to the first month of the fellowship and have not touched. I have a financial advisor named Kwame Sidhu who helped me establish an index fund portfolio 7 years ago and who calls me every quarter with updates that I actually understand because I spent the better part of a decade learning to read financial documents the way I learned to read insurance policies, from the inside out. No one in my family knows any of this. Not the title, not the salary, not the scope of what my department handles. My mother knows I work in insurance. My uncle Gerald knows I finished some kind of school program. Rochelle knows I do something with claims, whatever that means. I had attended 2 family gatherings in the past 3 years, and both times deflected questions about my work with the phrase it is pretty technical and mostly paperwork, which is, in a narrow and absolutely deliberate sense, true. The first time I walked into the regional office with my name on the door and my title on the placard, and the authority to overturn a decision that had already been denied twice, I stood outside for a moment before I went in. Not from hesitation. From something closer to the feeling you get when you have been carrying a folded piece of paper in your wallet for 6 years and you finally have somewhere to put it down. I put it down. I went in. Patricia Lowe Harrington sent me a plant when I got the promotion. A bird of paradise in a terracotta pot that still sits in the left corner of my office window, where it gets the morning light. She attached a card that said, "You have been doing 3rd-year work since your 9th month." This title is just the paperwork catching up. I keep the card in my desk drawer. I have read it twice since, once on a difficult day, and once on the morning before a review I was not sure I was ready for. I was ready for it. I always am. The Kestrel logistics file had been sitting in secondary review for 11 days before it reached my queue. That is standard processing time for a contested workers' comp case flagged with documentation anomalies. The previous adjuster had noted 2 irregularities and recommended specialist review, which is how it came to me. I opened it on a Tuesday at 8:47 a.m. I read the company name. I read the employee's name. I read the supervisor's note. I read the date. I read the documented temperature. And then, very carefully, the way I have learned to be careful when something in a file creates a feeling I cannot immediately categorize, I set the file down and I made myself a cup of coffee before I continued. Because I knew Kestrel Logistics Solutions. I knew their break room and their attendance policy and their particular shade of corporate navy. I knew their Falcon logo, and the way the fluorescent lights in the third-floor corridor hummed at a slightly different frequency than the ones on the second floor. I had worked there for 4 years. I had worked there sick once, with a fever that the company nurse had documented at 103, and that had climbed to 105 by the time I drove myself home at midnight because I could not, under the terms of my employment contract at the time, accrue any more unexcused absences without triggering a disciplinary review. That was 19 years ago. I was 25. I was not yet Margaret Osaibansu, Senior Medical Claims Reviewer, Tier III Specialist. I was Margaret Osaibansu, Data Entry Clerk, 3rd floor, Kestrel Logistics Solutions, earning $14.30 an hour with a health insurance coverage plan so thin it had a $4,000 deductible and excluded mental health care entirely. The file on my desk was not mine. The employee was named Darnell Whitfield, and his situation was his own, and it deserved to be evaluated on its merits, on the documentation, on the policy language, on the regulatory framework that I had spent 11 years becoming an authority in. I picked up my coffee. I opened the file again. I had come that close to letting the past walk into the present before I was ready for it, but I wasn't ready yet. I needed to read every page. I needed to be certain, because when I made my determination, it was going to be the one that stood, the one that no second reviewer, no employer representative, no appeals panel was going to overturn. That is what it means to do this work correctly. I turned to page 1. I started reading. The Kestrel Logistics file was 412 pages long. That is not unusual for a contested workers' compensation case that has already been through one denial cycle and an employer rebuttal. What was unusual was the quality of the documentation on the employer's side, specifically, how clean it was. When documentation in a case like this is genuinely clean, it has texture. It has the small inconsistencies that come from real record-keeping across multiple departments, multiple dates, multiple staff members entering information in real time. This file was smooth. Every internal memo formatted identically. Every supervisor timestamp rounded to the nearest quarter hour. Every attendance log printed on the same paper stock despite covering a period that spanned 2 fiscal years, and according to the company's own HR records, a printer upgrade in March. I know what organic documentation looks like. I have reviewed more than 3,000 contested claims in my career. I know what it looks like when a company has had time to prepare a file, and I know what it looks like when a company has had time to prepare a file and also had access to someone who understood, at least partially, how review processes work. I flagged the file for a full forensic documentation review. I requested the original digital metadata from all employer-submitted records. I submitted the request on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I had received a partial response and a phone call from Kestrel Logistics Solutions General Counsel, a man named Bradford Teague, who introduced himself pleasantly and wondered if there was any additional documentation he could provide to expedite the review. I said I would follow up through the standard carrier portal and thanked him for calling. I made a note in the file. The note read, Employer Counsel contacted reviewing specialist directly. Date and time logged. Escalating to compliance protocol. That call told me everything I needed to know about how nervous they were. What it did not yet tell me, what I was still in the process of determining with the care that the situation required, was the full scope of what Darnell Whitfield had experienced. I want to be clear about this, because I think it is important. Darnell Whitfield was not a symbol to me. He was not a proxy for my own 25-year-old self, sweating through a midnight data entry shift in a building that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. He was a 51-year-old senior operations manager with a documented streptococcal infection, a fever that had been logged by the company nurse at 103 degrees Fahrenheit at 2 in the afternoon, and that had climbed 2 more degrees by the time he left the building that night, and a workers' compensation claim that had been denied on the grounds of insufficient evidence of employer negligence. His medical records showed that he had been hospitalized 3 days after the incident with sepsis complications. He had spent 11 days inpatient. He had required 2 specialist appointments with an infectious disease physician after discharge. His out-of-pocket medical expenses, after his health insurance coverage processed the claims, and I reviewed his insurance policy language carefully, totaled $19,000 $840, because his employer-sponsored plan had a 20% coinsurance requirement above the deductible with no out-of-pocket maximum for inpatient complications, classified as secondary to a pre-existing condition. The plan had classified the sepsis as secondary to what they coded as a pre-existing susceptibility to infection. I read that coding decision 3 times. I thought about the warehouse worker from my 9th fellowship month. 14 months of medical expenses. I thought about what $19,840 means to a person who has just spent 11 days in a hospital bed. I called Patricia Lowe Harrington on Thursday evening. Not about the case. We maintain a strict separation between my professional determinations and anything that could be characterized as outside influence. I called her because she had sent me a bird of paradise and a card that I keep in my desk drawer, and because there are moments when you need to speak to someone who knew you before you were the person on the placard. I told her I was reviewing a case that had some personal adjacency. I told her I had already implemented the standard recusal evaluation protocol and determined that my professional relationship to the matter was sufficiently removed from any personal history to proceed, but that I wanted to document the conversation. She said, "Is your analysis going to be sound?" I said, "It is always sound." She said, "Then document it and proceed. That is what the protocol is for." We talked for 12 more minutes about her retirement plans and the bird of paradise, which had apparently put out 2 new leaves, and then we said goodnight. I went back to the file. Sylvia Moreau-Baptiste's office was already involved, not in the Whitfield claim specifically, but in the parallel compliance matter I had initiated the moment Bradford Teague called me directly. That was a separate track. That was a track that Kestrel Logistics Solutions did not yet know existed, and that I had every intention of keeping quiet until it was complete. Desmond Fairweather Hall stopped by my office on Friday morning. He stood in the doorway with his coffee and looked at the stacks on my desk and said, "Kestrel?" I said yes. He said, "How long?" I said, "Another week, maybe 10 days. There's a metadata request outstanding." He nodded. He said, "Bradford Teague called me too. He said it the way you would say the weather is coming." I said, "I know, I noted it." He said, "Good." He left. That was all we needed to say. What Desmond did not know, and what I had not yet told him, because the documentation was not yet complete, was that the metadata response I had received on Thursday had confirmed what I suspected. 7 of the 23 employer-submitted documents had been modified after the date printed on their headers. The modifications were not dramatic. They were the kind of adjustments that someone makes when they understand, in a general way, that documentation matters, but do not understand, specifically, how medical records forensics actually work. The attendance log for the day of Darnell Whitfield's incident had been opened and received 11 days after the date it was purportedly created. The supervisor's memo, the one that noted, in careful corporate language, that the employee had been reminded of the mandatory attendance policy and had chosen to remain on premises, had a metadata timestamp of 4 days after Whitfield had been admitted to the hospital. That memo had been written after the hospitalization. They had written a contemporaneous-looking record after the fact to establish that the employee's presence in the building had been voluntary. I sat with that for a moment. Then I opened a new document and began drafting my findings. The Whitfield analysis took me 9 days in total. I submitted my determination on a Wednesday afternoon at 4:23 p.m. The finding was detailed and specific and cited 41 specific documentation failures, 7 instances of post-incident record modification, and 3 direct violations of the Georgia Workers' Compensation Act's employer duty of care provisions, as they apply to documented communicable illness in a supervised workplace environment. My recommendation was not ambiguous. Full claim reversal, maximum employer liability under the applicable policy provisions, and mandatory referral to the Georgia State Board of Workers' Compensation for a compliance investigation. The claim was denied. That is the sentence I opened with, and I need to finish it properly. The claim that had been denied, Darnell Whitfield's initial workers' compensation filing, denied by the previous adjuster on the grounds of insufficient documentation, was denied a second time. My determination reversed that denial. When I say the claim was denied, I mean the denial was denied. The original decision was overturned. Darnell Whitfield's claim was approved in full, covering all documented medical expenses totaling $19,840, plus the 11 days of lost wages at his documented salary, plus an additional compensatory assessment against Kestrel Logistics for the cost of the compliance investigation that my referral had initiated. That is what I did with the file. But that is not actually the whole story. That is the part that happened at work. The other part, the part that intersected with the Falcon logo, and the fluorescent hum, and the 19 years of silence, that part was already in motion by the time I submitted my findings, and it had nothing to do with Darnell Whitfield's claim directly, and everything to do with what reviewing that file had confirmed for me about Kestrel Logistics Solutions, about the way institutions protect themselves, and about the fact that I had personal documentation of my own from 19 years ago that I had never used. Not because I had forgot, because I had been waiting until I understood exactly what I had. I called Sylvia Morrow-Baptiste that Wednesday evening. Not about the compliance referral, that was a Hargrove and Pellman matter, and went through Desmond. I called her about something I had never spoken to any attorney about before. I told her I had a personal matter. I told her I had documentation. I told her the timeline. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "How thorough is the documentation?" I said, "It is thorough." She said, "Send me what you have, do not send it to your work address. Send it to my private intake." I sent it that night. She called me the following morning and said 4 words before anything else, "This is very thorough." I signed the first engagement letter that afternoon. There was no going back. I want to explain what the documentation was because I think people imagine these things as dramatic, a single smoking gun letter, a hidden recording, something cinematic. It was not cinematic. It was 19 years of the habit of a person who learned, at 25, working in a building that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, that the only protection you have is what you write down. I had kept every pay stub from my 4 years at Kestrel Logistics. I had kept the company nurse's log entry from the night of my fever, a copy, made on a shared office copier at 10:30 at night, that I had taken because something in me understood that documents have a way of disappearing. I had kept the email from my supervisor at the time, a man named Carl Brennan, informing me that my attendance record had triggered an automatic disciplinary review flag, and that I was expected to report to work the following morning or face a formal written warning. I had kept the written warning itself, which I received 2 days later despite having reported to work the following morning, because the system had already flagged me and the flag had already processed. I had kept my termination letter, which arrived 6 weeks after the incident, citing a pattern of attendance concerns. I had been fired. 2 months after working a full shift with a fever of 105 degrees Fahrenheit, I had been fired for attendance. I had never told anyone, not my mother, not Dr. Achampong, not Patricia, not Desmond. I had put those documents in a manila envelope, written the date on the tab in black marker, and filed them in a box that had moved with me through 4 apartments and into my current house, where it lived on the second shelf of my home office closet, behind a box of old textbooks. I retrieved the box 2 weeks after I submitted the Whitfield findings. I sat on the floor of my home office with Ptolemy in my lap, a new Ptolemy, the third of that name, a gray tabby who had no idea what he was witnessing, and I went through every document. I cross-referenced them against the current Georgia Workers' Compensation statute, which I had some familiarity with. I made a list. I called Sylvia. What Sylvia told me, after reviewing everything, was that the individual statute of limitations on my personal claim had long expired. I knew that. I had known that for years. That was not what we were discussing. What we were discussing was the pattern, the documentation I had of Kestrel's conduct 19 years ago, which, when placed in context alongside the Whitfield case documentation that was now part of a public compliance investigation, constituted evidence of a persistent institutional practice. That evidence could be submitted as supporting context in the compliance proceeding. It would not generate a financial settlement for me personally. It would contribute to the regulatory record. Sylvia said, "You understand this means you will need to submit a formal statement. Your name will be part of the compliance file. Kestrel's counsel will see it." I said, "I know." She said, "Bradford Teague will see it." I said, "I know." She paused. She said, "Are you certain?" I said, "I have been certain for a while. I was waiting until I understood exactly what I had." She said, You have a pattern of conduct documentation spanning 19 years that directly corroborates the evidentiary basis of an active state compliance investigation. You have contemporaneous records that their current counsel cannot challenge because you made them in real time before anyone knew there was anything to challenge. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to be your attorney on this." I said, "You already are." My Uncle Gerald called me on a Saturday morning 3 weeks into this process. He called, as Gerald calls, without preamble. He said that the family was planning a gathering in October, a celebration of what would have been his mother's, my grandmother Cecilia's, 90th birthday, and that he expected everyone to attend. He said Phyllis was handling the food. He said Rochelle was flying in from Houston. He said my mother had already confirmed. He said, "You work in insurance, right? I have some questions about a policy I am looking at. Maybe you can take a look." I said I would be happy to look. He said, "Good. You can explain it to me at the dinner." There was no question in the sentence. It was an assignment. He had, in the space of a single phone call, arranged my attendance, assigned me a task, and hung up before I could respond to either. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. He had no idea that Sylvia Morrow-Baptiste had, 48 hours earlier, submitted my supporting statement to the Georgia State Board of Workers' Compensation. He had no idea that the statement included, as an exhibit, a certified copy of the company nurse's log from 19 years ago, authenticated through the board's document verification process. He had no idea that Bradford Teague had received a copy of the submission by certified mail that same morning. He had no idea what I had become. He thought he was calling the person who could explain his insurance policy at a dinner. I put the phone down. I confirmed my attendance. I went back to my desk. I want to tell you about the dinner, because it is the part that people ask about when I imagine telling this story, and because the reality of it was so different from what I think people expect that it almost requires its own kind of preparation to describe. The dinner was held at Gerald's house in Decatur on the third Saturday of October. It was a warm evening. Georgia in October can still be warm, and Gerald had set up tables in the backyard under string lights that Phyllis had ordered online, and that Gerald had spent most of the afternoon hanging with the help of my cousin Darnell, who had driven up from Macon. Not the Darnell from my file. A different Darnell. The world has more than one. There were 22 people at that dinner. I know because I counted when I arrived and seated myself at the far end of the long table, next to my mother and across from Rochelle's husband, a quiet man named Terrence who worked in logistics and who I had spoken to perhaps 40 words total across our entire acquaintance. My mother patted my hand when I sat down. She said, "You look well." I said I was well. She said, "You seem different." I said I had been working hard. She accepted that. Gerald was at the head of the table. He said grace, which he does at length, and with the particular confidence of a man who believes God is listening specifically to him. He mentioned my grandmother Cecilia by name. He mentioned her generosity. He mentioned her love of family. I looked at the string lights above his head and I kept my hands flat on my lap and I let him finish. Dinner was served. The food was good. Phyllis has always been able to cook, and whatever her other qualities, I can say that without qualification. We ate. People talked. Rochelle told a story about Houston traffic that went on longer than it needed to. Terrence asked me about my job and what I recognized as genuine polite interest, and I said it involved reviewing insurance documentation, and that it was, as I always say, technical and mostly paperwork. He nodded and went back to his food. After the main course, Gerald poured himself a second glass of wine and turned to me down the length of the table. He said, "Margaret, you were going to look at that policy for me." I said I would be happy to. He said, "It is a life insurance policy my financial advisor is recommending. I want to know if the coverage terms are standard." He passed his phone down the table with the policy document open. I looked at it. It took me 45 seconds. I said the coverage terms were standard for a whole life policy at his age, and that the exclusion clause on page 3 was worth noting. It excluded coverage for any illness documented as pre-existing within the 5 years prior to the policy date, and he should make sure his medical records were current before the underwriting review. I passed the phone back. He said, "See, this is useful. This is why it is good to have you at these things." He said it to the table generally, not to me specifically. I said, "I am glad to be useful, Gerald." He had no idea that Sylvia had emailed me that afternoon. I had read it in the car before I came inside, to tell me that the board had accepted my statement into the evidentiary record and that a formal hearing had been scheduled for November. He had no idea that my name was now in a public compliance proceeding. He had no idea that the compliance proceeding had been covered, briefly, in a trade publication that morning. A short item noting that the Georgia State Board had opened a formal investigation into a logistics company's workers' compensation practices, citing a pattern of documentation irregularities spanning nearly 2 decades. He had no idea. He was passing his phone back to me at a dinner table under string lights, in a backyard where his mother had once told me I was the one who was going to do something with it. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. I drove home that night with the heat on low and Sylvia's email open on my phone in the cup holder. I know you are not supposed to. I was stopped at a light, and I thought about the piece of paper I had folded and put in my wallet when I was 26 years old. Health Information Management, Bachelor of Science Completion Track, Carver Technical Institute, cohort beginning January. I had not thought about that piece of paper in years. I did not know exactly when I had finally removed it from my wallet, sometime in the fellowship years probably, when the thing it represented had become the thing I was actually doing. I did not throw it away. I am almost certain I still have it somewhere. In the box on the second shelf of my home office closet, probably, filed with everything else. She thought she had won. They had 2 more months. The formal hearing before the Georgia State Board of Workers' Compensation was held on a Tuesday morning in November, in a conference room on the 14th floor of a state office building on Mitchell Street in downtown Atlanta. The room seated 32. There were 41 people present, because some of the Compliance Board's administrative staff had come in additionally, and because Kestrel Logistics Solutions had brought a legal team of 4, including Bradford Teague, who was exactly as pleasant in person as he had been on the phone, and who looked at me across the conference room with the controlled expression of a man who was revising something rapidly in his mind. The board's presiding officer was a woman named Commissioner Adiz Okafor-Williams, a 26-year veteran of insurance regulatory work who had, I later learned, written one of the 2 standard reference texts on workers' compensation forensic documentation review in Georgia. She had a reputation for running hearings efficiently and without theater, which suited me entirely. Desmond was there, representing Hargrove and Pellman in the capacity of claims authority, because the Whitfield claim reversal was the proximate trigger for the investigation. Patricia Lowe Harrington had driven down from her home in Roswell because she said she wanted to be present, and that was all the reason she needed to give. She sat in the second row on the left side of the room. She had brought the Bird of Paradise card, which she showed me before the proceedings began. She said, "I thought you might want a reminder." I said I did not need one. She kept it anyway. Sylvia sat to my left at the witness table. She had a leather portfolio and a pen and the particular stillness of someone who has been in many rooms like this and knows exactly what each moment requires. Gerald was there. He had been subpoenaed as a character witness in the context of the estate matter, because Sylvia had filed a parallel civil submission, not a lawsuit. I want to be clear about what this was and was not. A formal complaint with the Georgia Probate Court regarding the administration of my grandmother Cecilia's estate. Arguing that the executor had acted in breach of his fiduciary duty by applying discretionary distribution in a manner that contradicted the documented expressed wishes of the decedent, evidenced by 3 witnesses who had been present for conversations in which Cecilia had stated her intentions. One of those witnesses was Harold Tedjasant, the loan officer at Meridian Community Credit Union, who had approved my student loan 16 years ago, and who had, it turned out, been present at a church gathering where Cecilia had spoken about her grandchildren 2 months before she died, and who had, when Sylvia reached him, remembered it clearly and was willing to say so in a signed affidavit. The other 2 witnesses were longtime friends of my grandmother's who were both still living and who had both said, when Sylvia contacted them, essentially the same thing, that Cecilia had been clear about her wishes, that she had spoken about Margaret specifically, and that they had always wondered what had happened. Gerald walked in and saw me at the witness table and stopped walking for approximately 2 seconds. That was his only visible reaction. He is a composed man. He found his seat. He did not look at me again for the first 40 minutes. Commissioner Okafor-Williams called the hearing to order at 9, 7 a.m., she outlined the scope of the proceeding. The primary matter was the workers' compensation compliance investigation into Kestrel Logistics Solutions. The secondary matter, introduced as evidentiary context relevant to the pattern of conduct finding, included my personal statement and supporting documentation. Bradford Teague objected to the inclusion of my personal statement on the grounds that it predated the statute of limitations for any individual claim. Commissioner Williams said, "The statement is admitted not as a basis for individual liability, but as evidentiary context for the pattern of conduct finding, which has no statute of limitations in a regulatory proceeding." Objection overruled. She said it without looking up from her notes. That was the first document. I had 3 more. The second was the metadata analysis, the certified forensic report from Hargrove and Pellman's documentation review team, submitted through Desmond, confirming the post-incident modification of 7 employer records in the Whitfield case. Bradford Teague's co-counsel made a technical objection regarding the chain of custody of the digital evidence. Commissioner Williams addressed the objection in 4 sentences, referenced the applicable administrative code provision, and moved on. I watched Bradford Teague write something on his legal pad and then stop writing. His hand went still on the table. He did not pick up the pen again for several minutes. The third document was the nurse's log from 19 years ago, the copy I had made at 10:30 at night on a shared office copier, certified now through the board's verification process, showing a documented employee temperature of 103 degrees Fahrenheit at 2:17 p.m., and a supervisor notation authorizing continued work presence. The document had my employee ID number on it. The same ID number appeared in Kestrel's own archived employment records, which the board had subpoenaed. Gerald, sitting in the gallery, had been still. When the log was entered into the record and Commissioner Williams read my name from the document aloud, Margaret Osibansu, employee ID 4471KL, data entry, 3rd floor, I heard from the gallery a sound. Not a gasp, something smaller, the sound of air leaving a room slowly. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes on Commissioner Williams. Sylvia, beside me, did not move. The 4th document was the termination letter. My termination letter from Kestrel Logistics Solutions, dated 6 weeks after the incident, citing attendance concerns. Filed as Exhibit D, entered into the record. Read in summary by Commissioner Williams in a voice that did not editorialize and did not need to. I heard a chair shift in the gallery. I heard my mother say very quietly the word Margaret. Just my name, nothing after it. I did not turn around. Commissioner Williams addressed Bradford Teague directly. She said, "Does counsel for Kestrel Logistics wish to offer a response to the pattern of conduct documentation at this time?" Bradford Teague said, "We would request a recess to consult with our client." She granted 15 minutes. He conferred with his team. He came back to the table and said that his client wished to explore a settlement framework. Commissioner Williams said, "That conversation will proceed through the board's standard compliance settlement process. For the record, I am noting that the documentation presented today establishes a clear and consistent pattern of conduct constituting a violation of Georgia Workers' Compensation Act provisions governing employer duty of care over a documented period of not less than 19 years. That finding is entered into the record regardless of any settlement outcome." She moved on to the probate court matter. The estate attorney Sylvia had retained for the parallel filing a woman named Constance Ajumobi of the firm Ajumobi and Pellerin, presented the affidavits from Harold Tedyasant and my grandmother's 2 friends. Gerald's attorney, a man who had clearly not expected the level of documentation in front of him, made 2 objections. Both were addressed and overruled. Commissioner Williams noted that the probate matter fell outside her direct jurisdiction, but that the evidentiary record would be formally transmitted to the relevant court. She said, "The probate court will make its own determination. That is their function." Gerald's attorney leaned over to him and said something in a low voice. Gerald nodded. His hands were on the table in front of him, flat and still. He was looking at a point somewhere past my left shoulder, toward the window, and he did not look at me once for the remainder of the proceedings. The hearing concluded at 12:44 p.m. Desmond shook my hand in the hallway. He did not say anything elaborately. Desmond is not an elaborate man. He said, "Good work." Patricia Lowe Harrington hugged me, which she does not do often, and said, "Third year work since your ninth month, and you have never stopped." I thanked her. I meant it. Sylvia and I stood in the elevator on the way down. She said, "Constance thinks the probate court will order a redistributive accounting of the estate. It will not be the full 15,000, there are legal costs, there is time elapsed, but there will be a figure." I said, "That is fine." She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes, I meant that too." My mother was waiting in the lobby. She was standing near the building's entrance with her coat over her arm and her purse held in both hands, the way she holds things when she does not know what to do with her hands. I walked up to her. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "I did not know." "About the fever, about them firing you." I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that. I said, "Because I needed you to be there and I was not sure you would be and I could not afford to find out at the time." She looked at the floor. She said, "I am sorry, Margaret." I said, "I know you are." I held her hand for a moment. Then I put my coat on and I walked out into the November morning. The Kestrel Logistics Compliance Settlement was finalized the following March. Under the terms of the legal settlement, the company paid a regulatory fine of $214,000 to the Georgia Workers' Compensation Board, implemented a mandatory occupational health policy, restructuring with third-party monitoring for 5 years, and provided additional compensatory relief to Darnell Whitfield, bringing his total recovery to $31,200. The compliance finding and the settlement terms are public record. The probate court issued its order in February. After legal costs and the years elapsed accounting adjustment, the redistributive figure was $9,600. Sylvia called to tell me. I said, "That is fine." She said, "You are not disappointed." I said, "My grandmother left me something worth more than $9,000 a long time ago. I have been spending it ever since." I used the $9,600 to fund a professional development grant through Hargrove and Pellman's internal foundation. The grant supports employees pursuing certification in health information management who are working full-time. It is named the Cecilia Osai Bonsu Professional Development Award. The first recipient was a 28-year-old claims processing associate named Denise Fortuné, no relation, as far as I know, to my old neighbor Mrs. Adiz Fortuné, though I have thought about that coincidence more than once. Denise passed her certification exam in June. I sent her a plant. I am still at Hargrove and Pellman. I am still at the corner desk that faces the window. I still have the bird of paradise in the left corner, and it has put out 6 new leaves in the time since this happened. Ptolemy III is doing well. Kwame Sidhu, my financial advisor, tells me my retirement savings are in a position that he describes as solid, which from Kwame is high praise. I have dinner with Patricia Lowe Harrington twice a year, at a restaurant near her house in Roswell that has very good jollof rice and a window table she always reserves. I see my mother. We are careful with each other in the way that people are careful when something has been broken and repaired. The repair is real, but you know where the seam is. I think that is honest. I think honest is the most I can offer, and I think she would say the same. I do not see Gerald often. When I do, he is cordial. I am cordial. There is a specific kind of quiet between us that I think neither of us will ever fully fill, and I have made my peace with that. I think about Darnell Whitfield sometimes. I looked up his LinkedIn profile once, professionally, with the straightforward curiosity of someone who reviewed 1,400 pages of a person's working life. He is listed as the Director of Supply Chain Operations at a different company now. His profile photo shows him at what looks like an outdoor event, laughing at something off camera. I closed the tab. I did not reach out. His life is his own, and my role in it began and ended at a desk on a Tuesday morning at 8:47 a.m. I keep the piece of paper in my home office now. I found it in the box, behind the manila envelope with the nurse's log and the termination letter, still folded twice, slightly soft at the creases from 6 years in my wallet. Health Information Management, Bachelor of Science Completion Track, Carver Technical Institute, cohort beginning January. I put it in a small frame. It is on the shelf above my desk at home, next to a photo of my grandmother Cecilia, and a spare certification plaque that Hargrove and Pellman issued me when I made senior reviewer, and that I keep at home because the one on the wall at work is sufficient, and I am not a person who needs 2 plaques on display. I look at it when I need to remember what it means to want something quietly, for a long time, without anyone watching. And if there is anything this experience taught me, it is this. 1. The most powerful thing you can do with silence is fill it, with study, with documentation, with the slow accumulation of authority that no one can take from you because no one knew you were building it. 2. Documentation is not bureaucracy, it is memory with teeth. Write down what happens, date it, keep it, because the people who wrong you are counting on you to forget, or to believe that what you remember does not count. 3. Your identity is not a function of what your family decided you were at your most uncertain. It is the sum of every choice you made after you stopped waiting for their permission to become it. Was I wrong to say nothing, to let 19 years pass without telling a single person in my family what had happened to me at Kestrel, what I was building, or what I had in that box on the second shelf of my closet? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.